for the purposes of consistency and persistence, because when we're exposing corruption in government, like in state or in church or whatever it is, we have to be persistent because those who are engaged in corruption are constantly on the move and constantly fleeing. So because they're fleeing, the Bible describes them and their behaviour and their tendency. It says, "The wicked flee though nobody pursueth, but the righteous are as bold as a lion." So we must remain bold. We must remain bold when we're exposing corruption, because corrupt people flee. And they like to remove paper trails and try to remove accountability. And where they can't remove their name from a dealing, they will try to allow the trail to go quiet and say nothing about it. And so they like to, block people in or try to immobilize them or remove their finances for the sake of quieting them or preventing them from going to the capital, to bring it to the attention of the people who might be in the know and might be aware, who would actually do something about it. Unfortunately, we live in a day and age where most people who are of an official status within government, who work within the organs of state or in the public service or civil service, whatever the case may be, are corrupt because they've gone away to serve the devil, and that's how they got their position in the first place. So in order to get on in the world, many cases, most cases, pervasively, 99% of the time or 99.9% of the time, the people in positions of power, positions of leadership, are serving the devil. And that means, unfortunately, that the world is pervasively corrupt. So that being the case, obviously then, therefore, those who are exposing righteousness don't expose exposing unrighteousness, don't expose corruption because they hope to suddenly overturn the monopoly on the organs of state, which Freemasons and servants of the devil have cornered or gained position within. No, rather it's to expose the corruption before the people, because it's only the people's awareness of the corruption that can make these men sweat. Whenever the people become aware that the politicians are doing something and resist them, especially in a parliamentary democracy like Ireland, the politicians sweat because they don't want to lose their position. And they don't want to be held accountable for their corruption, which in many cases could see them in jail for 40 years minimum by way of treason. As in the Constitution of Ireland, the Treason Act, Section 1 of the Treason Act, says that if you commit treason in this land, you can spend a minimum of 40 years in prison. So obviously this is very, very serious stuff. If these men are engaged in corrupt activity within their office, misconduct to the measure of treason, then of course they must be held accountable to the courts of Ireland. So one of the main corruptions that we now see in our day is that governments and officials are legislating to protect themselves in misconduct. And we have evidence of this. Like it says, in Ireland it says that the President, if found in misconduct in his office, cannot be held accountable before the courts of Ireland. What government in its right mind would ever remove accountability or responsibility for those who have been endowed with the most power in the way of preservation of the Constitution, such as the President, Michael D. Higgins? Why would they say to him, there's no accountabilities, there's no incumbency, there's no culpability in terms of you being held accountable for misconduct, so just do whatever you want? When they're the people in those positions which are specifically designed and outlined for the preservation of the Constitution itself and the defence of the nation. Why would you ever tell those men who've been positioned in those key positions as it pertains to the upholding and enforcing of the Constitution and the law, like Michael D. Higgins has as president, that they don't have culpability, accountability or incumbency by way of the responsibility and the power that's given to them in office before the courts of Ireland, which is the arm and the instrument of accountability when it comes to the law. So I don't know how anybody could reason that the President of Ireland, endowed with a responsibility to uphold the Constitution and enforce the law, can be at any stage told, but you yourself are immune. You yourself are immune to the arm of justice, but you must ensure that legislation is in line with the Constitution. But you don't have to do that as a prerequisite measure, which means not at all. Because if the President doesn't ensure that a bill, before he signs it into law, is constitutional before he signs it into law, he has no further dealings in the matter. And somebody might say, why? Well, if somebody, a citizen of Ireland, wants to check the constitutionality of a legislation, they have to bring it before the High Court. The President's not involved at that stage. So his office is compromised, meaning the nation is compromised, meaning the government is compromised. Because he lets something in as law, signs it in as law, is claiming he doesn't have to check constitutionality as a prerequisite, when of course he does as custodian of the Constitution. If he has no further opportunity to be involved in assessing its constitutionality, surely he must do that at the only position and point in time where he has access to do so. Because you can't be custodian of the Constitution and not check constitutionality at the only opportunity you have to check constitutionality, which is prior to signing a bill in to the legislature or into the law. So Michael D. Higgins' one and only opportunity to check constitutionality is prior to signing a bill into law. So as custodian of the Constitution, duty bound by oath of office and promise to the Irish people, to check constitutionality of bills, he's claiming now that he doesn't have to. So how can he perform the duty of custodian if he's claiming he doesn't have to check constitutionality? Because it wouldn't be him after the fact. It would be the High Court of Ireland, it would be the Court of Appeal in Ireland, it would be the Supreme Court in Ireland, but it wouldn't be him at that stage. So he hasn't done his job and is no further involved in the processes thereafter for checking constitutionality, but has failed to assume the duties to move into that role, to step into that role as custodian, by claiming he doesn't have to check constitutionality of bills as a prerequisite measure. So the Freemasons have placed him there, because he is one of them, and have handed him bills. Sign that in, sign that in, sign that in. And as custodian of the Constitution, Michael D. Higgins hasn't checked constitutionality of these bills, because the Court of Appeal are telling us to presume them constitutional after they've gone through the High Court and the Court of Appeal. We were commanded to presume them constitutional. So we've evidence that Michael D. Higgins isn't checking the constitutionality if there's something in the Constitution that is merely presumed constitutional. We know that he's no further involved in the matter because he wasn't at the High Court and he wasn't at the Court of Appeal. So where's his involvement after his initial failure to test constitutionality? Where is it? Where's Michael D. Higgins' involvement as custodian of the Constitution? Where is it? We haven't observed it. But the Court of Appeal in Ireland are committing treason and sedition, commanding the Irish people to do the impossible and to do the unlawful, presuming on the constitutionality of legislation. So we now have a treasonous usurpation occurring through the seat of President of Michael D. Higgins and the High Court of Ireland under Miss Justice Siobhan Phelan, who, after being duty-bound and tasked with the testing of the constitutionality of sections 115 and 117 of the Criminal Justice Act 2006, elected to refuse, without excuse, without reason, to carry out that test after the court case was opened and the test was scheduled number 1 on the schedule of the court to carry out. But elected rather, midway through the case, to abandon the test and conclude that it remained an open question whether it was lawful or not, or constitutional or not. One and the same. Then, for another reason, because they wanted to see the overthrow of my convictions, or the my acquittal of the convictions, to be overthrown and me thrown in prison, brought it for judicial review to the Court of Appeal and failed again to test constitutionality of those sections. Didn't even enter into a test themselves at Court of Appeal level, and then went one step further than the High Court and commanded us to presume them constitutional after it had been through 2 courts that refused to test the constitutionality of them. So Michael D. Higgins refused to test, the High Court refused to test, the Court of Appeal refused to test, and then the Court of Appeal said, we must presume them constitutional. That's treason on the part of Michael D. Higgins, on the part of Miss Justice Siobhan Phelan, and on the part of the conspiratorial 3 judges of the Court of Appeal, which judged that sections 115 and 117 of the Criminal Justice Act 2006 must be deemed presumptively constitutional. Well, you can't presume on constitutionality because you don't lack the evidence. Who knows the law and the Constitution? President studied in constitutional law. The High Court, Court of Appeal judges, they would know the Constitution. Barristers at law, which prepared for up to a year for testing sections 115 and 117, and didn't even appeal the judge's refusal, but claimed it was a victory after the judge abandoned the test of the constitutionality of section. So they're all conspiring together, from solicitors to barristers to the President to the High Court to the Court of Appeal, to refuse and to fail to carry out the testing of the sections of the Criminal Justice Act 2006. Refusing to point blank test them. No excuse, no reason given. But commanding the Irish people to presume them constitutional. Consider that for a moment. Just consider it for a moment. That the President, barristers at law on my side and the side of the state, solicitors, Judge Miss Justice Siobhan Phelan of the High Court, and the 3 well-experienced senior citizens, senior judges, they're not young men, I'm saying, they're maybe in their 50s. 3 of them, well experienced, because you have to be a solicitor before you can be a judge. Well experienced, refused to test the constitutionality of these sections. When we know and have evidence that they're unconstitutional, telling guards that they can prosecute in court and represent each other's evidence in each other's absence and operate in civil matters where they've no jurisdiction. all of these corruptions of our Constitution and our law, found in sections 115 and 117 of the Criminal Justice Act 2006, have been ignored. And we've been commanded to presume them constitutional. When if there's a guard absent from court on a speeding fine, it gets thrown out. Because he can't represent his evidence, and nobody else can represent it for him. Yet, they're telling us that we're being commanded to presume these things constitutional. And that means you must behave towards these writings as though they were the law. You must obey them as though they were the law, even though they refused at every juncture to test them officially before the courts. Even after they committed to doing so and scheduled it in the court case, they refused to complete that task. That's treason. That's a knowing refusal. That's an acknowledged refusal to do your job. That is treason. Because as custodian of the Constitution, Michael D. Higgins, he must carry out that task. But they're writing legislations behind the Irish people's backs, not engaging administrative protocol when it comes to the Constitution and to the democracy that we have in Ireland, are writing legislations hand over fist to create the illusion that they're not breaking the law when breaking the law. In the first place, saying that that Michael D. Higgins doesn't have to check the bills for their constitutionality as a prerequisite to signing them in. I don't know how anyone thinks he could perform the office of custodian of the Constitution and not check constitutionality. That's not sane. It's not logical. That's not straight thinking. That's mad. And then they're saying that if Michael D. Higgins or any other president for that matter is found in misconduct, that they're not accountable to the courts of Ireland. So how do you hold a corrupt president accountable for his crimes? They're saying you can't. They're saying you can't. They're saying that the president is above the law, in effect. This is treason. This is serious seditious activity. This is an attempted overthrow, and it is an overthrow at the moment of the effective implementation of the Constitution and the organs of state, as outlined in the Constitution by the Irish people. And this is a democracy. So these usurpers are legislating at will to remove the effectiveness of this democracy. That is sedition. That is treason. That is imprisonable for at least 40 years. This is serious, serious stuff. The Courts of Appeal in Ireland have ruled that something that they were tasked with testing must be considered presumptively constitutional. That is their admission that they don't know whether it is or it isn't. Officially, whilst they have knowledge whether it is or it isn't academically. Now that doesn't make sense. Because if you have the academic learnedness of theory such that you cannot possibly remove that knowledge, you cannot play dumb to order and command people to pretend or presume like something is lawful when you must, by way of your office, know whether it is or it isn't. It's like telling a mechanic to look at an engine and pretend he doesn't know anything about it. That's an impossibility. And it's like him saying, I'm going to test your engine now. Oh, wait. I've abandoned the test. Just presume that it's working fine. That's exactly what it's like, except you know the mechanic has better knowledge than that. If he's looked at this thing, he must have found something, and he's not willing to uncover it or work on it or do the job. He must have looked at that. If you have barristers at law spending a year on preparing to test the constitutionality of sections of the legislation that aren't all that complicated, they must know already whether it is or it isn't constitutional. Because these guys don't go into court unprepared. They go in knowing their position. Like your barrister goes in knowing whether something's constitutional or not, and then states his case. And then the opposition go in knowing whether it's constitutional or not and state their case and position. But people can know whether something's lawful or not, but not necessarily admit that. So if somebody knows it's unlawful and pervasively everybody involved doesn't want to admit that, well then obviously they're going to drop the test and run away from it. And that's what happened. So it's not that the mechanic didn't look at the engine, metaphorically speaking. He did, for a year. And they'd said, I'm abandoning the test of your engine. What? You've looked at it for a year. You didn't find anything? Did you find anything? Yeah, I'm abandoning the test of your engine. That's not sane. You can't pretend that you didn't find anything. You looked at it for a year. Just presume it's working fine. You're going to endanger me, putting me in a vehicle as though it's working when you said you tested and now you've abandoned that test? Highly suspect conduct. Madness, some might say. Obeying a legislation as though it were lawful. But you spent a year checking and refuse to conclude what your findings were? And to go through those motions in the court of law? Consider it. They spent a year checking these sections. Then suddenly, once the court case commences, the judge says, oh, we abandoned that test. Remains an open question whether it's lawful or not. Well, close the question and carry out the test. Why does it remain? Then it's judicially reviewed. The judges of the Court of Appeal, realizing that it was supposed to be tested and wasn't, they stated this must be considered presumptively constitutional. Well, what are you judicially reviewing if you're not going to judicially review? Are you judicially reviewing the constitutionality of sections 115 and 117? Because the previous court abandoned the test. Why are you also abandoning the test when you're supposed to be judicially reviewing? So both you and the High Court admit you didn't complete the test, but we should pretend that these sections are lawful? Highly suspect. You don't know the law? The Court of Appeal and the High Court don't know the law such that they're commanding people to presume on lawfulness? What confidence can we have in them? We mustn't be commanded to presume on lawfulness when it's the President and the court's job to know the law so that we can know the law and know that the law has been implemented in our courts. Because those who presume on constitutionality can't be trusted with the implementation of the Constitution. They've admitted it. Because you can't presume and know. And not only do they claim not to know, they refuse to check. which is worse. And then after all of that mess, they command us to pretend that they checked in the absence of the check and the test. This is sedition, it's treason, and there is no logical or reasonable excuse for that type of conduct from learned men or anybody. This is a deliberate and orchestrated refusal to check for the purposes of the concealment of the mechanisms and the failings which are allowing such legislations to come into the writings and be implemented for the obedience of the citizens. We don't have to obey presumptively anything, because as Irish people, the only presumption in law is presumption of innocence. Because ignorance is no excuse as a precept of law. Ignorance is no excuse. So if ignorance of the law is no excuse for breaking it, how can you command somebody to be ignorant? Because presumption is the lack of evidence, which is a form of ignorance. Why? Lack of evidence is lack of knowledge. It's exactly the definition of ignorance. So now we have a court and courts and presidents that are commanding the ignorance of the nation, even when they've been duty bound to remove any ambiguity or doubt or lack of clarity as it pertains to the lawfulness of legislation or its constitutionality, because they're interchangeable terms, constitutionality and lawfulness, because they can never oppose one another, so they must be interchangeable. So constitutionality means lawfulness. You're telling me to presume on the lawfulness of a command? Presume what I tell you is the law? No. I'm not allowed to do that. The precept of law is ignorance is no excuse. Presumption is no excuse. You can't command me to presume anything. And when you have been tasked with checking the constitutionality of the legislation, you are duty bound according to the Constitution to carry out that test. You can't abandon it. You're not allowed. Because you've recognised that it should be checked, and then you've refused to check it after committing to check it. That's treason. That is treason in this land. We're talking high-level, militarised attack on the Constitution of Ireland and at the people of Ireland by Freemasons in the seats of President, in the seats of the courts. They are conspiring against us to contort, distort and pervert our laws, and to lead the Irish people to ignorant compliance with unconstitutional bills and writings, which they haven't gone through the proper administrative procedures as custodian of the Constitution, as judges and lawyers and solicitors and police, to ensure the lawfulness of them prior to commanding the people to obey them. It's not acceptable. That's usurpation. It's a militarised occupancy. Instead of with the gun, it's with the pen. These men are impostors and traitors against the Constitution of Ireland. And Miss Justice Siobhan Phelan too. This is my solemn belief. I have evidence. My name was used in the facade as being somebody who was bringing this test to the attention of the state of Ireland. To the High Courts, I represented you as the Irish nation. In the courts, my name was used. They said they would check the constitutionality, number one, in the bill, and they abandoned it. And they published the conclusion up on courts.ie before I heard anything about it. And my name was used in this court case. These are out of control criminals. And they're all in bed together. They're all conspiring together. The Law Society, they're all Freemasons of the Freemasonic Lodge, the freemasonic, satanic worshipping cabal, which I got to Master Mason in, and as soon as I realised it was satanic, I left, I resigned, and they started to systematically pick apart my life and my family. And these men have conspired together on this issue and on this matter and shown their hand. And the fact that they don't care about the Constitution of Ireland. It's very clear. They don't care about submitting to the law, only about exacting their satanic agenda, which is the immoralization of this nation. The demoralization of this nation. So we must expose it, we must persist, we must be consistent, because they mean business. But so do I. So I will be consistent. So share these videos, guys. Share them all around, and let's get certainty as to what is and what isn't constitutional in our writings in this nation, and be an example to the rest of the world to hold their governments accountable to their constitutions. Because they're there for a reason. Your granddaddy put it there to protect you. So wakey, wakey. Jesus loves you. Return to him today. Say it and believe it today. Jesus is risen, Lord, and you can be rescued from hell and from these wicked men who are demonized. And that's why they're doing Satan's will. Blessings in Jesus' name. Holy kiss.